Welcome to another episode of The Edge. My name is Jaiden Tabor. In my generation, many students are overwhelmed and facing the serious topic of anxiety. Anxiety affects 40 million Americans, sometimes diagnosed as young as age 10. The disorder can progress as time goes on and become more damaging to the affected teen. With the help of therapy and counseling, teenagers can learn to cope with the anxiety and find ways to manage. That is where the importance of Mr. Matthew R.Tutay comes into play. With 8 years of experience in his field, a bachelor's in psychology, and 2 master's degrees in science and social work, Mr. Tutay is a licensed social worker in the state of Pennsylvania and is a clinical director at South Park High School. We are here to address the subject of anxiety and have Mr. Tutay give a better understanding for our viewers. Thank you for being here today.
Thanks for having me.
You're welcome. So would you like to give us a little bit more background on your background, just becoming a counselor and stuff like that?
Sure. So I actually graduated high school a year early because I'm a nerd, and I decided to go to W&J because my grandmother made me. And when I was there at 17, I had no clue as what I was going to do or what I was going to study. So I kind of tailored my classes to my strengths, which was primarily English at the time, and I was like, this is so boring. It just wasn't for me. So I jumped track a few times, did the pre-law, pre-med thing. Neither one of those were suited for me. So then I ended up being fascinated with psychology. Funnily enough, it wasn't my strongest subject right off the bat, but I just was genuinely interested in it. So from then on, I went to graduate with my bachelor's in psychology, as you said, and then went on to a master's program at Cal U, then another master's program at Pitt, and then experience in the field. 8 years later, here I am.
Yeah, that's great. I'm glad to hear that. So would you like to give a definition of anxiety to start us off?
Sure, I'll keep it simple for everyone to understand. So the Crisis Prevention Institute defines anxiety as a change in behavior.
Yeah.
And really, in order to detect that change in behavior, you first need to be aware of someone's baseline. So right now we're sitting and having a conversation, and if we start to feel anxious, there are usually tells from our body that we can pick up on. Some people, put their hands by their face, and it's usually that change in behavior that's the first sign of anxiety spiking.
Yeah. So would you say it's a generalization to make that everyone experiences anxiety, or do you think that's safe to say?
Everyone experiences anxiety on some level to some degree.
Yeah.
It's a very human emotion, a very normal one.
Yeah. So whenever you are working with students and you suspect that they have anxiety, what are your coping skills that you recommend for them? How do you take your course of action?
Yeah, so primarily the 2, maybe 3 kinds of things that work the best for anxiety is, first, you have to be calm enough to be able to think clearly. For instance, if you're afraid of planes like I am, I'm not thinking the low percentage of fatal plane crashes, right? To calm myself down, my emotional response kicks in and almost overpowers that reasonable part of my mind. So in order to actually get any benefit or any progress in that kind of treatment modality, you have to first be calm enough to get that, to access that thinking part of your brain. So, cognitive behavioral therapy approaches are like thinking better to feel better, as simply as you can say it. It's just think about things a little bit better so that you can feel better, live a happier life. And then there are exposure therapies along with that are really effective for anxiety. So running away from your fears usually doesn't work. It sometimes makes it even worse, but confronting them in a way that sets you up for success is something that's really helpful for students.
Yeah, of course. So what are like the most common symptoms you see mostly?
Most common symptoms, it's either intrusiveness, avoidance. You can see some hyperarousal from time to time, and then the negative cognitions and mood that go along with it. So intrusiveness is just the things that you keep thinking about that you don't want to think about. If you're not accepted into a certain friend circle and that's all you seem to ruminate and perseverate on and fixate on, then that's one of those things that kind of you wish wasn't such a big part of your life. The avoidance piece is maybe that friend group is some group that you avoid intentionally because you don't want to experience the anxiety or that level of internal discomfort that goes along with interacting with that friend group. So you may avoid them altogether. And then because you're thinking these things more regularly, if you're truly anxious on a more clinical level, then you're probably going to be more hyper aroused in terms of your physiology. So the biology aspect of it, your body's going to be a little bit more on alert, on guard, and it's going to wear you down.
Yeah.
It's going to wear you down. So, and then along with that, obviously, come the negative thinking patterns, and then moods associated with all those things.
Yeah, of course. So whenever, like you said about the pushing away from the friend groups, whenever you see somebody that's struggling with social anxiety, how do you push them to, go over that anxiety, angst, or whatever it's called?
Yeah. It's a gradual progression. So there are two types of approaches to this. One can be like completely overwhelming the person and putting them in this, fully immersing them in this situation, more than ever, but saying like, hey, nothing catastrophic happened, so you did fine. I mean, you may felt like you were dying on the inside, but nothing really catastrophic happened, so you're okay, you can do this.
Yeah.
So there's some evidence that flooding is what it's called works, but the more sensitive approach would be to gradually work someone up to that point. So if lunchtime, for instance, is a triggering event because there are designated social groups usually in lunch, and you usually sit by certain people and whatnot, and you probably have thoughts about that. So some people who have severe anxiety may not even be able to eat lunch in the lunchroom, for instance.
Yeah.
So a first step would be to walk past the lunchroom. And if you can do that, then it's take a step in the lunchroom, then it's have a seat in the lunchroom. And you work with the smallest steps to set that person up for success.
Yeah.
Acknowledging that they're going to be uncomfortable the way along the way, but also preparing them that they can do this. So it's that gradual, successive progression that really helps students gain the confidence to deal with some of those social anxieties.
So if I see someone struggling, how would you recommend that I would help that person?
I think positivity and a welcoming attitude can go a long way.
Yeah.
So you can set an example for the rest of your peers or any bystander who's watching or observing by just your attitude and your response to someone who is struggling, and simply by inviting them to your lunch table when they're not used to talking to you, or for instance, is something that would go a long way, I would suspect, for that person who's struggling.
Yeah, and in today's day and age, with the social media aspect, the bullying aspect, I think that's very important for everyone to get involved and help out with the anxiety for people that struggle.
For sure.
So whenever you work with other students that don't only struggle with anxiety, you work with other people that, like other mental illnesses. Do you think anxiety is one of the hardest to treat since there's no cure for it?
I don't think it's one of the hardest to treat. There is no cure for it. We do have medications that are really effective with short-term anxiety, but anxiety is compounded or complicated with thought disorders. So it's really your mind and how you think that really makes that anxiety even worse than it has to be. So really, it's the therapy and thought corrections and getting you thinking a little bit more positively so you can deal with the unpleasant feelings and overcome them ultimately. And that's not really that complicated, at least in my opinion. Compared to some of these other disorders that we have, this is a very treatable one. Yeah.
So do you think that gender role plays different weights in the anxiety affecting boys and girls?
Yeah, so around your age, we have 30% of females who can be clinically diagnosed with an anxiety disorder, in comparison to around 20-some% in males who are diagnosed with clinically with an anxiety disorder. So the female gender is more vulnerable to be more anxious.
Yes.
But you do have an edge on the males in this way. You develop a lot faster typically, so your prefrontal cortex, that part of your brain that's close to your forehead, the thinking part of your brain, is developing a lot faster than males, so that can help you deal with some of the anxiety potentially.
Yeah. So do they cope differently, boys and girls, would you say?
Yes, definitely. So the typical response for a guy is to just internalize that and to bottle it up, so to speak. For the girl, we see a lot of venting with friends.
Yes.
I mean, that's the main coping strategies that we see when we compare genders. Yours is actually, being a female, your gender does a better job at coping with it, because at least they're kind of getting some thoughts out and kind of can be in that dialogue where some of those thoughts might be challenged and then discarded if they're really compounding the anxiety. But guys, if they just bottle it up like they're susceptible to do, then that's a lot harder to work with, because that comes out in behaviors. Usually maladaptive behaviors start occurring.
So like you said earlier, when people are draining themselves with this anxiety issue and they're not getting help, what other effects can it have physically on you, on the body?
Lack of sleep's one of the biggest ones. So at adolescent age, you guys are supposed to be getting around 8 hours of sleep every night, but the person with diagnosable anxiety is probably getting nowhere near that. They probably have struggles in 3 of the most common areas. They have trouble falling asleep, they have trouble staying asleep once they fall asleep, and they have trouble waking up too early, So that lack of quality sleep, REM sleep, and deep sleep is probably something that can, if it perpetuates, would really affect someone's daily routine over the long haul.
Yeah, and that drains you energy. Yeah, that's very draining. Yeah. So what other kinds of, so whenever you see somebody who's got a heavy workload, they're doing sports, all AP classes, all this, they're overwhelmed, they're drained, this energy, how do you help, recommend that they slow down a little bit with their life?
Yeah, well, everyone's different, so everyone has a different tolerance threshold. So some people can thrive in that kind of structure and expectation, but some people don't. It's really easy to tease out the people who really thrive in that kind of routine and busyness, and those who just kind of fall apart as a result. So if it's someone who is falling apart because it's just too overwhelming, you're going to need to taper back. You're going to need to first get them to have the insight to acknowledge that this is not going to work for them, even if they want it to, and then prioritize what's most important to them so that they can carve out a schedule, a daily life schedule that's more amenable to what they can tolerate. Yeah.
So what other treatment options are available outside of therapy, counseling, talking about it? You mentioned medications.
Those are the primary ones so far for anxiety. The biggest is exposure therapy. So if you don't want to do any services, there are a lot of things on YouTube. Surprisingly, there are a lot of things in the library with self-help books and stuff like that. And really what the consensus is that the more you gain confidence by overcoming those situations on your own, it helps to have that support, no doubt. But the more you can do that on your own, the more confidence you build to overcome situations in the future that are like that.
Yeah. So whenever people are put in the situation where they don't feel what they're doing is helping, like medications aren't helping, can that have different side effects making it worse, would you say?
It just depends. It's really how they think about it, how they interpret it. I mean, some people can say, oh, this medication didn't work instantly, so that means I'm defective. That's the wrong train of thought to have, by the way, so you want to kind of correct that in therapy. Or someone can say, the more healthy thought is this medication didn't work for me, but there are several other medications out there. And it's not a one-size-fits-all thing. That's usually a concoction of medications that has to be trialed and error before we get to the right dosing and the right blend of medications that really helps me. and I can be patient with the timing of that if I trust in the process.
All right, so let's talk about a little bit about what you do at South Park High School, how you help students. You said you counsel them, you talk with them.
Yeah, well, that's maybe I wasn't clear enough, but SPHS is Southwestern Pennsylvania Human Services.
Okay,
yeah,
perfect.
It's okay.
That's
so
okay.
It's an agency,
Yeah.
and it's a mental health and drug and alcohol rehab facility. So.
Oh wow.
Yeah.
That's a lot different.
It's a lot. It
Yeah.
is a lot different, but we get students, we get children
Patients,
and adolescents. We've seen kids as young as 2 years old, so
Wow.
all the way up from there. And what our primary roles are, at least on the front lines when we're doing therapy, is to really engage the person and to meet them where they're at. A lot of people don't even want to be in therapy,
Yeah.
quite frankly. And I don't blame them. It's not a desirable thing, but if you want to take responsibility for making your life better, then that's the counselor's job to win you over and convince you of that.
So how do you ensure people feel comfortable talking with you, since you said that not all of them like it?
Yeah, I just try to be really transparent.
Yeah.
I mean, some people won't like me, unfortunately. Some people will, but if I'm honest, I'm transparent and I'm genuine. If I'm genuine, authentic, if I truly listen, that's one of the most valuable things. Most kids and adolescents don't want to be told things.
Yeah.
They want to express things and have someone genuinely listen without their own agenda, perhaps. So that might be one of the most powerful aspects of what a therapist can do, and something that I definitely try to do when I see clients.
Yeah, so what happens if they're not really working to get better with you with the therapy? When do you recommend a more serious option, such as like inpatient care, medications like we talked about? Yeah,
usually we're just patient with the process.
Yeah.
So unless the consequences are a lot more severe, and for example, I'll use one of the most severe. If it's causing themselves harm or someone else harm, then that's when we look at inpatient services as a higher level of care. But if they're just struggling, that's to be expected. The process is not an overnight one by any means, and it usually takes a lot of time for someone to come around to the idea that this stuff works and that they can actually try it and possibly succeed with this.
Yeah. So like you said, with the most severe cases, how can I and my fellow students help if we suspect that something like that is going on?
I think you just be human.
Yeah.
I mean, as simple as that sounds, that's really what it comes down to, is you show that you care, you show that you're a concerned person for another person who's struggling. That's really all it comes down to. It's easy to walk by the person who we know struggling. It's easy not to say anything. It's easy to keep our mouth shut. It's easy. It is much, much easier. But it is also more rewarding when we can make a positive impact on someone's life who is struggling. So it's not the easy route to take, but it's often the rewarded route of just stepping out and doing the anti-high five thing, what no one else seems to be doing,
Yes, of course. So whenever people are struggling with anxiety, it can cause other mental illnesses, correct? It can cause OCD, depression, other stuff like that. So what kind of stuff do you help with when you have started with anxiety and you've progressively gotten worse?
Yeah, well, anxiety disorders are highly comorbid with depression. So that's the most common that we see, is that anxiety usually links up or correlates very closely to depressed mood, at least. And your question was, how do we deal with that?
Yeah, whenever it's just getting worse and
Yeah, so it's obviously, if what we're doing is not working in the process of therapy, then we need to be flexible enough to try something else. So there are tons of theories out there. There are tons of approaches out there. There are tons of interventions out there. And if we're a one-trick pony as a therapist, we're not serving our population very well. So it's almost what we do on our end by making ourselves more versatile in the knowledge we have and interventions we use and the way we connect with people, that's really going to go a long way in making a change or causing a change of direction in that progressive worsening path.
Yeah. So what other causes, like, can home life be a cause of anxiety, depression, such as those things like that?
Yeah, absolutely. Home life can worsen anxiety or depression or improve anxiety or depression. It really comes down to this key word, supportive. It's how supportive people are when they're encountering someone who's being anxious. The social learning part of us says when someone's anxious, then I have to be anxious. And then someone else's voice is high, so mine has to get a little bit of higher in volume. So humanly, we're conditioned to match other people's emotional mood, whereas someone who's struggling just wants to see that you're a marker of calmness a lot of time and that everything's going to be okay. So we have to almost fight our own instincts in order to portray this idea that it's going to be okay even though it doesn't feel like it will be okay.
Yeah. So whenever you realize that the home life is a big major cause for the person who's struggling, what course of action do you take to get them out of that situation?
Well, we try not to get them out of it. We try to pull the family members into it because in all likelihood, they're going to be connected to their family for the remainder of their lives. So in those types of situations, we try to engage the family members and involve them in the therapeutic process, and hopefully make some headway through them too in that family dynamic.
Yeah. So there's a little bit of a miscommunication. As I was doing my research, I saw some people get confused with OCD and anxiety. So what are the differences there?
Well, OCD is an anxiety-based disorder. So the main difference is that anxiety tacks on a compulsive piece. So OCD is obsessive compulsive disorder.
Yeah.
Obsessive is the thoughts. Those are the anxious thoughts that are running through your head constantly. But the C, the compulsive part, is the really differentiating factor in OCD, because now you have behaviors or compulsions that are oftentimes a little bit irrational in a sense. Like I have to flip on and off my light switch 100 times before I leave the house, or someone in my family will die. Or I have to check that the door's locked at least 10 times before I leave just to make sure it's locked. So it's that anxiety that starts off, that thought pattern of fear that starts off, and usually the behavior serves as some kind of correction for making that thought okay. So if I'm fearful that my family isn't safe enough, I do all these things, X, Y, and Z, in order to ensure that they're safe enough. And some of those things truly aren't even related to ensuring the safety of the family. So that's where OCD kind of takes an evolution from anxiety alone.
Yeah, but it's still, as you said, very draining for the person, I'm sure. So what other options do you recommend for that kind of behaviors, like the coping for that?
Yeah, for that, it's very similar since we're talking about anxiety, and OCD is an anxiety disorder. Really, you're just working with the thoughts and now the behaviors that are associated with the issues of insecurity, whether they be fear of protection, fear of safety, fear of losing something, fear of gaining something that they don't want, whatever the fear is. It's rooted in the same kind of anxiety disorder. So we just address the behavioral component in addition to the negative thought patterns that are usually coming along with that.
Yeah. So simply, how do you recommend for people who are struggling, how do you simply decrease stress? How do you decrease your workload, just make things calm without going the path of therapy, without going to counseling? Like just simply by doing it by yourself, what kind of ways would you recommend?
How do you reduce stress? Well, you have to know your body well enough to know when it is stressed, first of all, in order to be able to identify when you need that stress relief. So first step is awareness. You have to be cognizant enough of what's going on inside you in order to come up with ways to really relieve some of that stress. And then the second step is really whatever works. I mean, that might not be as specific of an answer as you're looking for, but
Yeah.
for some people it's exercise.
Yeah,
That's a
exercise.
very helpful way to relieve stress because you're working your muscles to the point of exhaustion. You're forcing your body to relax, even if it doesn't want to. So that's why exercise tends to be a good go-to coping skill for some people, especially in our more conscientious physique type of world we live in today.
Yeah. So, like you said, exercise. Do you recommend other different hobbies for that kind of, for OCD, anxiety behaviors, finding a hobby that you can like use to get away from the stress?
Yeah, those things are temporary relief. So anything that you can find outside of you is going to be temporary relief or alleviation from whatever you're experiencing internally. But the key to everything is actually inside you, within you. So nothing works like a change of self-concept. So if you truly are an insecure person, just flipping to the side where you believe that you're a secure person, now you have permanent relief from the anxiety that you experience. And you have a sense of overcoming of that when it comes up in the future. But those other things that you can do, like exercise or deep breathing or progressive muscle relaxation or exposure type of therapy, that stuff will ultimately help you temporarily get through the tough times.
Yeah. All right. So, well, before we run out of time, I wanted to address the topic of technology. So, do you think that that can also play a role on anxiety?
Well, because anxiety is such a thought-driven disorder, that just makes you more aware of what other people are thinking. So the vulnerability is there. You become macro aware, I say. You become more aware than you need to be aware of what other people are thinking. And then again, you have thoughts based on what other people are thinking, and that can go down a bad path pretty fast, or it can actually fill your head up and blow your head up pretty fast. So you usually see the extreme, someone who has extreme popularity, they usually have an overinflated sense of self and can be egotistical, and contrarily to that, some people can get even more anxious because they're connected to those social media outlets that just make things more problematic.
Complicated. Yeah, I've definitely seen that more, struggling personally with the social media, just having to be on my phone all the time, having to see what everyone's doing. I definitely can relate to that aspect of struggling. Well, thank you so much for joining us today. It means a lot that you could come.
Yeah, thanks for having me.
So thank you again for joining us and giving us a better understanding to viewers about the mental illness anxiety. Thank you for watching. My name is Jaiden, and this was another episode of The Edge.